It's modern technology. Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for your feedback there, and you can all apparently hear me. So, welcome to Pain or Gain, Return on Investment and Other HR Metrics. My name's Eleanor Nickerson. I'm the Director of the UK Operations at the Top Employers Institute, and I've been with the company for 4.5 years. I have a background in HR management and consulting, and I want to say welcome. Thanks for joining us. We've got a really nice webinar lined up for you, and thanks to the aforementioned wonder of modern technology, we have quite a diverse geography online today. Max, our subject matter expert, is based in Hampshire. I'm 20 miles north of London in St Albans, and you are all over the UK, and we even have some people dialing in from as far away as the Netherlands, Spain, and South Africa today. So welcome to you all, and let's cross our fingers that that was the only technical hitch and that technology stays on our side. So if for some reason that the call drops, just bear with us a minute or two, we'll dial straight back in. So this is a loose agenda for what we're going to cover in today's webinar. We're not going to stick to it strictly, and we might jump around a little. And we do encourage questions from you as we go along, so please feel free to type them into the chat box. If there's a lot of questions, we can't promise to answer all of them, but we will try to answer them afterwards. We will be sending out some slides later to everyone who attended, and we will also be sending out a brief survey in the next few days to find out what you thought about the workshop and to also see if there's any demand for a follow-up webinar or even a face-to-face workshop. So please watch out for that. And in the next few minutes, I'm going to run quickly through a few slides about the Top Employers certification. The reason for this is that whereas many of you on the call already work with us, some of you don't, and it's just important for you to understand what exactly we do to set a little bit of context for why we're holding this webinar today. So I promise that will just be a couple of minutes. And again, if there's any questions, then we will try to get them answered for you. So, Top Employers Institute, we're a global certification company. We've been doing research for over 20 years into HR practices. We're headquartered in Amsterdam in the Netherlands in a absolutely lovely canal building, which is quite typical of Amsterdam. And we're an independent, privately held company. We're not linked to any government department, we're not franchised, and whereas we have media partnerships in the various countries around the world that we work in, we're not linked to a news corporation or anything. Our certification is an annual global certification, and we're looking at HR practices and employee conditions. So this is built on a comprehensive examination of a company's HR practices and employee conditions. We're objective and fact-based. So most companies nowadays realize the importance of surveying their employees, but Top Employers examines something completely different. We describe this, or a good way to describe it is using the car as an analogy. So we're not asking someone what they think of the car, what it's like to drive around in, which is their opinion. We're actually looking under the bonnet and seeing the specs that are there and what would affect that person's opinion in the first place. We're looking at what exists and what's in place for your people, as we believe it's these things which affect the end output and the end result, and ultimately employee opinion engagement. We have a standardized approach, so our methodology is consistent, which means that, for example, multinational companies can draw direct comparisons between countries and see the differences in practices, or companies with multiple subsidiaries can see like-for-like comparisons between businesses, which is really useful if you're looking to harmonize practices or identify gaps in your offerings. And we have a validated, audited process. So our process is rigorous. For those of you who have been through and got certified with us, you'll recognize that. There are steps along the way to ensure that all companies are accurately represented, that ensures companies can demonstrate or show us that they do what they say they do. But also to ensure that the Top Employers Institute is fair, objective and consistent. So we have our methodology validated by Grant Thornton each year, and I think that we are the only employer accolade that actually conducts an external audit of itself each year. I promised these slides would be quite fast. I hope for those of you who don't know us, it's not too fast. So finally, about the certification, it's a tool. It's a tool that can help strengthen HR practices and employee conditions. It's a tool that can help support or build an employer brand, and it's highly versatile. You can survey employee opinion during tough times and get a result you probably already knew, but you can use top employer certification during any times to demonstrate that you're a great employer and that you're committed to investing in and looking after your people. Also, it's a great tool when recruiting. So just wrapping up about what we do here, we certified 73 companies this year in the UK and over 900 companies certified globally across nearly 100 countries. This is just a snapshot of some of the companies that we have certified this year. There's too many to fit on one screen for you, but it just gives you an idea of the kinds of organisations that are taking part there. We have companies of varying industries, size, cultures, HR maturity, all taking part. And next, we're going to have a very quick look at some of the stats from this year's research. There's just 2 pages here of these stats. And what we see is a clear trend of HR reporting KPIs to the executives or the board, essentially to the organisation. So from our research this year, 85% of top employers report talent management KPIs to their executives. 82% of report workforce planning KPIs, 64 onboarding, 82, another high one there for learning and development, 76 report performance management KPIs, 69% leadership development, 68% for career and succession management, and then the lowest percentage that reports KPIs is from comp and bends. Now, obviously, we have a lot of data and we couldn't really go too deeply into that today because, well, for those of you who certify with us, you'll know how big your full benchmark report is. Each of those areas, we collect data on what kind of KPIs people are reporting there. So for instance, with something like talent management, it might range from internal promotions to turnover rate. Each company is a bit different, but we definitely see trends in what kinds of statistics they're collecting. And one final page there, just looking a little deeper into just a couple of those areas. In learning and development, which is highly relevant for today's talk, 56% of top employers are expected to report stats. They analyse their L&D results in relation to business performance. 43% are measuring the return on investment of their learning and development programs. If we go to performance management, analysis of performance management results in relation to business performance, 64% of top employers do that currently. And then the last stat I've got on this page is return on investment of leadership development programs. 33% of top employers are reporting on that right now. So what these stats show us is that there is a demand from the business to produce stats from HR. But as we hear constantly from the companies that we work with, that is not always straightforward. And that is why we've put this webinar on today. And with that, I would like to introduce Max Bloomberg. So Max works extensively with the CIPD on HR metrics, and he's going to tell you a little bit about himself and then start with an introduction to human capital metrics. After these slides, we're going to jump back and forth between our case study video and a discussion with Max around the pros and cons of measuring HR. So, hello, Max.
Yes, good morning. Thanks very much, Elle. And welcome to everybody, and thanks for joining on what is a very important and topical discussion. Just to give you a very brief context of how I came into all of this I actually started life as a musician, which I could argue gave me the creativity that one needs to work in this field, because it's certainly a mix of art and science. And then, as you can see, I went straight into the science part of it, very heavily into computers and into mathematics. I had a technology company, so I actually ran a large operation, which we IPO'd in the 90s. And I did a PhD, more intending to go into psychology, but was asked by a FTSE company whether I could help them with their sales force and their salespeople to improve performance. Now, this was long before analytics had been invented, before your inboxes were filled with invitations for the latest technique, et cetera, et cetera. And so I just started applying the basic principles of good, what we called research analysis. And it was such a successful project. I thought, maybe we could consistently find a way to do this in organizations, to use data and evidence to help companies make better decisions about their people. And that's kind of where I come from. There's a technical background, there's a psychology background, and there's a business background. And that's what informs a lot of my thinking. I was also at Accenture for a couple of years as a consultant in the middle of that too. So moving on, I just want to quickly frame some context for why human capital is so important to an organization. And in this slide, I think of an organization like this. I think of the organization as an enterprise. So whether you're a commercial company or a government department or a research company, it doesn't really matter. Generally, you've got three kinds of assets or resources available to you to help you produce or do whatever it is you've promised to do to your stakeholders, your investors or central government or whoever it is. You've got your tangible assets, which are the things that you can kick. You've got, on the right-hand side, you've got your financial capital, which is the amount of money you've got in the bank. And then there's this kind of area in the middle called intellectual capital, which, as you can see, consists of your customers, the value or the revenue that your customers will bring to you. There's the human capital, which is the value that your workforce will contribute to helping you achieve your objectives. And then something called structural capital, which is how you join it all together. We're not going to go into that today. Well, the only thing I wanted to point out to you is that when we try and look at the value or the financial value, as boards often do, of each of those things, let's have a look at how easy they are to measure. Well, tangible assets, things like your buildings, things like your computer equipment, things like the technology that your company uses, those are quite easy to get a value on. You can call in a surveyor if it's a building, can't you? If it's technology, you can bring in an expert. So you can put a kind of a dollar value on that. Moving to the right-hand side, you can put a dollar value, if you like, on the financial capital. That's how much money you've got in the bank. Hopefully it's on your bank statement. The amount of money that your debtors owe you, the amount of money you owe to your creditors, any investments. The only thing that we can't put a value on easily today in 2015 is on our intellectual capital, which is your human capital and your customer capital. Now, customer capital, you can actually work out. So you could say, look, we know, let's say you're a mobile phone company or something, a telecom. You could say that we've got 1 million customers. Each of them is going to be paying us £50 a year for the next 10 years, and you can calculate the value. But human capital, how do you calculate the value of your workforce? Now, the question is it important to know the value of your workforce in the same way that you know the value of your tangible assets and your financial capital? And obviously the answer is yes, because we're spending more especially in knowledge-based companies, which I think a lot of you are there today. We're spending more on our human capital than we are on our tangible assets and our financial capital. In fact, over 50% of our revenue today goes on human capital, which is the one thing that we can't measure. We can't call a surveyor in or look at a bank statement. Now, that's really risky when you're spending so much money on something that you can't measure. And that's why it's so vital to understand what is the ROI. Whether you like doing it or not is another question. But the fact is, boards and investors, you have to find a way to do that. And we're just going to talk a little bit about it. Now, on the next slide, I just want to create a hypothetical situation of how do you, as HR people and business people on this call today. How do you do it? The model I use, I think about it this way. I say that you spend X euros or X pounds or whatever your currency is on an HR or a people program. By a people program, I mean recruitment, training and development, succession planning, anything that HR spends money on, I'm going to call a program or an initiative or a process, if you like. And the reason I'm doing that is to achieve a particular organizational objective on the right-hand side. In other words, I'm not spending money on training purely because I love my employees. Hopefully, I love my workforce and my employees, but I'm doing it because I need to achieve a particular organizational objective, like ensuring that I give the right return to my investors or ensuring that I help central government achieve the goals that the government is trying to achieve, or whatever my organizational objectives are. How does spending that money turn into or translate into objectives? I spend money, let's choose a training program today because that's what the video is going to be about. I spend money on a training program in the hope that it will change the behaviors of the people on the program. So program turns into behaviors or the how people do things in the organization. If they do the right behaviors, hopefully that will deliver the right employee performance, or the what they do, if you like. And if the performance is right, that will lead to the organizational objectives. So that's the model. Spend money on program to give us the behaviors, which gives us the performance, which gives us the objectives. The key here is to say that if you're spending money on a program and it's not giving you the behaviors, you're wasting your money. If those behaviors are not leading to performance, you're not aiming at the right behaviors. And if your performance is high, but you're not achieving your objectives, you're not measuring performance in the right way, which is why there's this huge debate about performance appraisal and performance reviews at the moment in the market. By the way, for people that tell me that they think performance appraisals and performance reviews should be scrapped, let me ask you, would you climb into a Boeing 747 with a pilot that has not had a performance appraisal? I don't think you would. So I think performance appraisals are going to be around for a while. Now, the video we're about to watch uses slightly different language to achieve that. They use this Kirkpatrick model, which I'm sure many of the HR professionals on this call will be familiar with. But just let me remind you, the language used there is slightly different. They say when you spend money on an HR program, it can be recruitment, training, succession planning, retention, whatever it is. The first thing to test whether that program is actually working in your organization, and we'll talk about working what we mean now, is that we first see what is the reaction of the participants, basically what we used to call a happy sheet, or what we still do call a happy sheet. And for many organizations, that's all they measure. But you know, it's not going to really help your organization just to have happy participants, is it? They've got to apply what they learned in the program. So you need to have application. If you have application, that gives you the business outcomes that you're looking for. And if you get the business outcomes, it gives you the return on investment that you spent on the program in the first place. So it's very similar to the model above, whereas the model above said money on program changes behaviors, gives you performance, gives you objectives. Kirkpatrick, same concept, slightly different words. Spend money, you get reaction, you get application, you get outcomes and ROI. In other words, working backwards from the ROI, you won't get ROI if you don't get the right business outcomes. You won't get the right business outcomes if people aren't applying what they learned. People won't apply what they learned unless you get the right reaction, and you won't get the right reaction unless you get something from the program as well. So that covers that. And Elle, I think that's probably a good point to switch over to the video. Actually, we'll cover the next slide a bit later.
Okay, so I will just go ahead here. So at Top Employers, we've certified East Coast Mainline, who recently became Virgin Trains East Coast for a number of years now, and we've watched their HR go from strength to strength. They were eager to measure the effectiveness of their L&D programs because they knew that these programs positively affected business. However, actually implementing measurements was a huge project for them. The end results were exciting for the L&D team and for the business, and they were eager to share their story with us. Unfortunately, Steph can't be on this call with us today to answer questions, but we're going to use the video interview, to form the basis for a discussion with Max, and we're going to stop and start it, only showing a couple of minutes at a time. And each time we'll discuss what we've talked about in more detail. Hopefully, there we go. Hopefully the technology.
I'm Steph Orton, Head of Learning and Development at Virgin Trains East Coast, and I've been with Virgin Trains East Coast for the last 4.5 years. We haven't always measured ROI at East Coast. We have measured the candidate or the delegate's experience through happy sheets, but that's really as far as we went. The reason why we weren't measuring ROI was a couple of reasons. I think the team found it really time consuming and lacked an understanding of how they'd go about measuring that longer term return on investment. And I think the business were really unclear what they were measuring. So we're measuring passenger growth or engagement. So there was a lack of clarity really on what it is we were making a difference on.
So for those of you who couldn't hear, I'll summarise that Steph Orton's been with Virgin Trains East Coast for over 4 years, and she was just explaining that they knew that they needed to measure ROI, but there was a lack of clarity from the business for what they needed to actually be measuring. So the next segment's very short as well, and then we'll pick up the discussion with Max again.
As the business started to go through a big change, we had greater clarity on what sort of things we were looking to measure and to change. And I really wanted to demonstrate the value and the worth of the team to help them understand the impact that they were making on the business, and also to help the business understand how learning interventions could help them. So it could be anything from a one-day workshop or an e-learning module or some team building, or devising some special projects that we could guide people through to help them understand a new business initiative or some change in the way that we're working.
So, Max, I'm going to go over to you for a discussion, Max. Firstly, and this is obviously a very big question, should every company be measuring HR metrics such as return on investment?
I think that's a great question, Elle. I think the first thing to look at in your company is how much money do you spend on people as a percentage of all the money that you spend. So if you're a commercial organization, are you spending in excess of, let's say, 20 or 30% of your revenue on people? If you are, there's no question that you need to be somehow looking at metrics and trying to work out whether that money is helping move your organization in the direction you'd like to, in the same way that your machinery and your buildings are hopefully doing it. If you're not a commercial organization, if you're public sector or a charity, you can see a proportion of the income. If you're public sector, look at the budget, your general expenditure. If a significant proportion is spent on people, you want to do that. Another factor to look for is some organizations are really traditional. So we find that analytics goes down really well in technology companies, because when you've got a bunch of basically tech heads like me in the organization, they get analytics, they understand why things need to be quantitative. So if you're very traditional, the culture may not lend itself. That doesn't mean you don't need to do it if people are a high spend. It means that you probably need to do some culture change before you attempt an analytics project. In my earlier days, I'm very guilty of having gone straight in preaching analytics, pushing it in, and it was never accepted. It never worked because it was just squashed by the traditional culture. So there are some indications. Look at the culture and ensure that you are spending enough money to just investment in analytics.
Okay, that's great. Does anybody have any questions for Max on that topic? I think one thing I would like to ask is, you saw briefly in the statistics that I shared from our research that there's obviously an increasing expectation to produce hard numbers for executives or the board, for the business effectively. So Max, how would you approach a situation where you didn't necessarily believe there was a need, yet there is pressure on for HR to deliver hard stats?
Yes, that. So, in other words, you've got the board or senior management are pressurizing you to deliver metrics, maybe because they've done an MBA recently. You can't do an MBA nowadays as an indication without having quite a large statistical and analytical component to it. It's always been there since the 70s or 80s, actually. So a lot of senior managers will be thinking like that. So it depends. If you as HR see that you need it, but the board don't think that they need it in that case, it becomes a change program, as we said earlier on. So let me emphasize that point. I've made it before, but I just want to make it bigger this time. Truly, analytics can't work in an organization unless the culture is ready. And actually, I can be more specific than that if you like. You can't prove the value of HR using analytics. People have got to believe that the HR function is useful or strategic before you can do analytics. In other words, if they think HR are primarily tactical and process and transactional, they're certainly not going to take you seriously when you say we'd like to bring analytics into the organization. So one of the first things you've got to do is for HR to be viewed as a strategic partner before you attempt analytics. So there are two things you've got to get right. The culture of the organization must be ready for analytics, and HR must already be viewed as a strategic partner. So if the board are not willing, but you think it's really important, HR then need to move into a change role. Let me give you an example of one way how we did it at one company, is that HR have made something called an HR workshop a compulsory part of every manager's development plan. So on your career development plan, if you are a manager, you need to attend a 2-day workshop in HR where the talent life cycle is explained to you, where it's explained how does recruitment work. It's not just a question of sticking an ad on LinkedIn or sticking an ad somewhere and doing it. We think about what is the profile of the people we need. So managers say, gosh, I didn't realize HR did that. I thought you kind of paid salaries and gave me my leave and so on. And you explain how training and development works, how it needs to be objectives led. So these 2-day, or you can make it a 1-day if you want, HR workshop is a compulsory part of every manager's career development plan. During that workshop, you can also explain what is HR analytics and HR metrics and so on, so that by the time managers come off, they understand what's available to them and how to do it, plus it builds the relationship with HR. So that's quite a clever way of changing the organizational culture by making it part of their development plans.
Okay, sounds good. We have a question from Andrea. She says, is there evidence that external investors are now asking for ROI on human capital?
Andrea, that's such a good question. Sadly, I'm personally a member of the Share Society and UKSA, UK Shareholders Association. We may even have some of them on the call today. In my work at the CIPD, we've done quite a bit of research with a very interesting project called Valuing Your Talent. And if you drop me a note afterwards, I'd be very happy to send you some details on that. Valuing Your Talent is all about organizations making transparent their human capital investments, so that if you're joining a company, for example, as a potential candidate, you can see how much does this company spend on average on development for each of its employees, because as a candidate, I want to join a company that's likely to be spending money on me. But at the same time, if you believe that in a knowledge economy, people's development and education is important to investors, you'd think that investors would be dead keen to say, well, I'm not going to invest money in a company that is not spending money on developing its people, because it's going to go nowhere. But sadly, many investors are of the opinion that every penny you spend on your workforce takes away money that you could be paying to me as a dividend. And so investors often have this kind of short-term perspective where they'd rather have jam today rather than in the company investing money in the people so that they can get the investment in 5 years' time. Private companies like Virgin don't have to do that because they don't have external investors, so they can afford to take a longer term view. So the answer is slowly over time, investors need to be taught that a long-term view for a sustainable share is important. Now, I can't say that's true for all investors, but many investors still need to learn that. So yes, the CIPD value in your talent research clearly shows that interest is starting to develop, but we've got a long way to go in even educating investors about the importance of human capital metrics.
That's great. Thank you, Max. I have one other question for you based upon that short video segment that we started to watch there, which is in the video, Steph says that there was a lack of clarity from the business about what they wanted to measure. Do you think that's a common issue?
All the time. The problem with analytics has become we just get so bogged down with the number of media requests and tweets, this seminar excluded, of course. But it's becoming fashionable at the moment. So you kind of think to yourself, gosh, why are we not doing analytics? Because you only employ 2 people, everything is automated. Oh yeah, but people don't think like that. They think, we've got to be doing analytics because everyone is doing it. And so you buy all of this expensive technology. I saw somebody the other day told me they've spent £15 million on one of the sort of the classic workforce technologies, and they don't actually have a particular problem that they're trying to solve. Why would you spend £15 million on something when there isn't a particular problem that you're trying to solve? So you need to identify the problem that you want to solve before you think about investing in technology or analytics people and all of that kind of thing. HR need to look for problems that are business problems. So you're looking at stuff like revenue or costs being too high, maybe retention. You're not looking at things like absence or engagement. Those are inputs. So if we go back to our earlier slide, if I just have a look at this quickly. So I hope you can see my cursor. Engagement is where my cursor is. It's kind of the behaviors part over here. What you need to do is to find, as HR, you need to find an organizational problem that you're having. Our costs are too high. We're not winning enough customers, or our customers are dissatisfied. And then you say, what might be the causes? Is it because our engagement is low? Is it because absence is high? And so you're trying to link people factors here to organizational objectives. So to answer that question, you need to, before you start an analytics program, always find some organizational level problem that is likely to be caused by a people problem. If you can't find one, if you can't find a problem that is caused by people, then you're probably not ready for analytics. And if you tell me you can't find any organizational problems, I think you're living in Never Never Land.
Okay, thank you, Max. Right, at this point, I'm going to hop back to the video. The next segment I'm going to show, for those of you who are struggling with being able to view it, all right, it's 1.5 minutes long, so just bear with us, and I'll try and put key statements that Steph is saying in the chat function box just as a kind of running commentary, although excuse any typos because I'm not the world's quickest or most accurate typer.
I started the process by looking at the capability I had in my team, their understanding of what return on investment really meant. So we didn't have a lot of capability or skills in the team, so I engaged a consultancy who specialised in Kirkpatrick methodology, and I set aside some development days just for my team to help them understand how they could measure everything on the Kirkpatrick hierarchy of measurement, from the learner experience. So we changed our happy sheets from being training and development led to learner led sheets that asked the learner what their experience was. right through to how we could measure some of the key performance indicators the business were working on, so things like engagement or customer growth. We had a look at our methodology, so how we set about doing a training needs analysis or understanding what the business needed. And I also developed a service profit chain model based on our behaviours and our values and how that linked back right to the customer experience, their satisfaction and ultimately profit. So using that model and the understanding of how Kirkpatrick worked, we were able to devise a toolkit which we call the methodology, and it's just a series of really probing questions that get underneath the skin of what the business really needs or each of the functions.
Hey, I tried to do some quick typing along with that. As you can see, it's not perfect, but hopefully it helps get the gist over there. So, Max, Virgin East Coast Rail had a good experience during this process, and in their case, they used a third-party consultant to help them. This is one of the areas where we really see the companies that we work with struggle. They ask us for input and help on what other companies are doing, because there is this growing pressure to deliver a business case for HR programs that's backed with stats. But what do you measure? Where do you start? What's involved? Should you work with a consultant or a metric analyst or go it alone? What are your views there, Max?
So the general rule here is that if you don't have the expertise to do the analysis yourself, you're probably going to need to bring somebody external in. If we just switch back to that slide for a sec.
Sorry.
That's all right. Yeah. So if we have a look, so the first question you asked is, when do you use analytics? Again, you always start by finding a particular problem that your company is having. Now, if you're a small organization, you could probably do this without using statistics. You could use qualitative methods, like there's something called the repertory grid. If you've kind of studied HR, you'll know about it. I think Elle's going to invite you to join an analytics group, HR analytics group after the call, where there are some free tools for doing this. So what you do is you find a problem that you need to solve, and then you try and work out what are the people, behaviors, and performance that might be linked to that problem. A smaller organization, you could learn the technique yourself as an HR person, the repertory grid technique. It would probably take you 2 or 3 hours to learn it, and you're probably on your way to doing it. If you're a larger global organization, you're going to need to get a consultant in to help you, especially if there's some statistics involved. In fact, the technique that you heard being used by Virgin Trains East Coast on the video, the Kirkpatrick technique, doesn't require a lot of statistics, but it may not be as accurate as some of the techniques available today. There are other ways of approaching it. It all depends, I say, on how much is the problem costing you. If it's a very expensive problem, you probably want to spend a fair bit of money on it. As a general rule, the cost of an analytic solution should be 5% to around 20% of the cost of the problem that you're trying to fix, if you're looking for some kind of measure on that. Elle.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. So we've got another section that I'd like to show you in the video. Again, it's 1.5 minutes long, so I'll try and put keynotes in. And this one looks at the challenges that Virgin faced when they started this process. Obviously, there's some good questions coming after that, because it's something that I think a lot of you will be dealing with.
We did run into some challenges. So lack of clarity from the business was one of the challenges. So, thinking that they thought they needed one thing, whereas we'd go in and do lots and lots of questioning and shadowing to really understand what it was that they wanted. So just trying to convince them actually that they thought they needed A solution and we came up with B, why that would work, and also working with them on what they wanted the outcomes to be, and they weren't always very clear on that. The other challenges we had were working with the unions, really, who were a little bit reluctant to engage with anything that they thought might be performance management or appraisal processes that are linked to pay. So we devised a new process for our frontline teams, which we call Time for You, and that is driven by discussion about their development and career aspiration, which we can then link back to some of the learning solutions that we put in. And we've been able to measure the success of that by internal promotions or people moving into new roles as a result of having those conversations. We work very closely with the unions now, and we have a team of union learning representatives who work with us to develop lots of different things we wouldn't have thought of. So, for example, mental health first aiders was an intervention that came from the unions that we've now implemented, which has then had a big impact on our absence management and understanding mental health at work. So it works perfectly.
Okay, Max. So it sounds like Virgin found some really positive ways to launch this program and measure things that included the people involved, and it's ultimately helped them to all work together more effectively than they did before. So what other kinds of challenges or problems do you see companies running into when they get stuck into problems like this?
Yeah, good question. One of the main things that you'll find is where do we start? So where does one kick off this process? If you haven't done it before, you won't really know. Bear in mind, traditionally, HR would have focused in the past on recruiting people who were more process-oriented. Is the training process running properly? Is the recruitment process, is the engagement process running properly? Rather than looking at the outcomes or linking those processes to say, look, the process is running properly, but is it giving us the right outcome? So one of the things you'll have is people that don't necessarily think in an analytics way. That's a challenge for most organizations. And if you don't know how analytics works, you can't create a plan. So the first thing to do is to create an analytics plan. And the way to do that is it's as though you're starting up a little business. Be entrepreneurial about it. Create a vision. So this is our analytics vision. The analytics vision of Acme Limited is to provide evidence that the HR programs we're running are making tangible contributions to our organizational objectives. So that's a challenge, is finding how you can get a plan. You can try and create one yourself, or you can get an external one to help it. The next thing is, how do you resource this? And you have many options. You can recruit people yourself in-house. You can partner with somebody. There are a number of solutions where you can outsource a lot of analytics. The technology, certainly you can use software as a service, SaaS, rather than bringing technology in-house. As a general rule, when you're starting out, I always think you should test analytics in an organization if you haven't used it before. So I would definitely use an external person initially just to see, is this going to work within our culture before you end up spending that sort of, 5 million or 10 million or whatever it is, and discovering it's not going to work. So always start analytics as a test thing. Bring in external contractors if necessary. Use their software. Don't you invest in software. And if you find that's working, then go into it. But the key is to create a plan. And often an analytics plan, there are many good consultants and external people who can help you. The CIPD can probably help with that kind of thing, and there are many organizations that could provide that kind of input. So that's one of the challenges, is not having the people, not having the knowledge. The other one that we spoke about earlier is the organizational culture. Can't emphasize how important that is. Another one is data silos. HR data, if you look back to our little diagram, you'll see that the data itself is pretty useless here. If this is HR data in this box, the behaviors and the employee performance, right? Then in a sense, the organizational objectives data, that will be things like customer satisfaction or financial costs or revenue, etc. That data will not be kept within HR, the organizational objectives data. So silos is a big problem. How do you find a single database that you can dump the employee data, the workforce data, and connect it up to that data. So data silos is something else you need to think. And in order to do that, HR needs to start getting very buddy-buddy with IT, because IT usually have access to how do you best join up data. So there are some of the challenges you might face and how you can address them.
Okay, great, thank you. So we were going to switch over to your slides and have a look at what kinds of human capital metrics companies should be examining.
Sure. So as far as these go, I just want to, and you'll get a copy of the presentation afterwards. I think, Elle, you're going to send that out?
Yep.
Okay, so before I go into the actual metrics themselves, I just want to say that there are two types of metrics that you're looking at when it comes to people. There's a set called efficiency metrics, and there's a set called effectiveness metrics. Now, the easiest way to describe those that I remember is from Stephen Covey's story in 7 Habits of Highly Successful People. He talks about the executive that decided that she wanted to climb the corporate ladder very quickly and become a CEO before she was 30 in a large organization. So to do that, she kind of gave up having any kind of personal life, relationship life, any of the nice things that one might look for. And she did. She succeeded. She got to the top of the corporate ladder and was the youngest FTSE CEO that had ever been known. The problem is that although she got up the ladder very efficiently and quickly, when she got to the top, she discovered that the ladder was leaning against the wrong wall. It isn't what she wanted. It wasn't effective. And for me, that really highlights the difference between efficiency and effectiveness. You can go very quickly, but you've got to make sure that the direction is right, that the effectiveness is there. And so when you're looking at metrics, always think to yourself, is this an efficiency metric or is it an effectiveness metric? So examples of efficiency would be things like the ratio of HR employees to total headcount. And the question is, so what if it's high or low? Does that impact whether the organization is achieving its objectives? Efficiency metrics are not linked to an objective, and that's the problem with them. So the total number of HR employees or variance in budget. Benchmarks are another example. So what if your company is spending less on training than another company? Maybe they're spending too much on training. Effectiveness metrics tend to look at things like what is the contribution per employee to the organization, or employee benefit costs. So with that in mind, and I won't have time to go through these in detail, but you can go through them once you have the presentation. I've put together 2 slides for you. These are drawn largely from a very good set from Vizia. And they class them into 5 different categories. Here, these are the metrics, people metrics, that are important for most organizations. You'll need to tailor them for sure for your organization. There's no such thing as a perfect set of metrics for everyone, because all metrics need to be context sensitive. So you can see the categories are, there's your retention of critical talent, a set of metrics. There are metrics talking about, are you bringing in people that are going to help you achieve your objectives, recruitment effectiveness. There's productivity, how productive is your workforce. There is compensation and pay equity that is critical for an organization, because the amount you pay your people really does impact whether they're going to contribute to your objectives. And finally, this thorny issue on performance management, which we could have a webinar on in its own right, because it's such a hot topic at the moment. Everybody's saying they're not doing it. And I personally just don't believe them, because when you're spending a lot of money on anything, you have to measure its performance. Maybe you don't do it once a year, like in the old days. You do it frequently and you do it in the form of conversations, but you're still doing it in one form or another. So there's a nice list of metrics that you can take away and start thinking about, could you get those together for your own organization?
Max, we have a couple of questions. Andrea asks if these are the effectiveness metrics that you're talking us through now.
Yes, I would say that most of the metrics on this list are effectiveness metrics, because they relate reasonably directly to organizational objectives. Some of them may be efficiency. Look, once you know that you're effective, the next thing to do is to work out, are you being efficient? So I'm not saying efficiency is not important, What I am saying is that first make sure that what you're doing is effective, that we are recruiting the right people, and then say, are we doing it in the cheapest and most clever way, most efficient way? First, is it effective? And now, can we improve it now that we know it's effective?
Okay, we only have about 5 more minutes left. So what I suggest we do is we have another question that's quite an interesting question that I'd like to ask you that's come in. But then after that, maybe I can actually let the rest of the video play out for anybody who can actually see and wants to stay around for the video, because we have time, as much time within the webinar as we want for anybody who wants to watch the rest of that. So the question that's come in is, if someone doesn't directly contribute to the bottom line, so i.e. they don't sell anything, works in a back office, for instance, how do you quantify their contribution or benefit?
Excellent question. Going back, do you see this little diagram here explains so much. Always come back to this diagram, make a little laminate and put it on a desk or something. So the question here is, how can you work with an employee or measure an employee where you can't access their organizational objectives? So the employees that it's easy to do that with are the non-back office. So anyone with budget responsibility is easy to work with in that sense. So somebody, head of a business unit, salespeople, all of those people have got specific financial budgets. People who've got quantitative outcomes, the number of widgets they have to produce in a period, it's reasonably easy to work with them. What about the rest of us, people who are in support functions, marketing, IT, HR? The answer is that analytics has not yet got an answer, or an easy answer, of how to work out how each of those individuals contributes to the organization. I reckon we're a good 3, 4, 5 years away from having readily effective techniques which can work on those. In the meantime, you will do yourself no harm whatsoever by focusing on these behaviors and performance of those back office people until you get to here. In general, if you're a large FTSE type organization, it's going to take you 2 or 3 years to get the behaviors and the performance systems in place. And by the time you've got those in place, we'll be ready to have a conversation about how do you measure an employee's contribution to organizational objectives. One way of doing it, it's controversial, but it's never failed for me yet, is I use 360s, and I ask people in a team to ask them to vote, or to rank, if you like, to say how much each person is contributing to the organization. Many engagement surveys already do that. There's nothing to stop you doing that in-house, and I've got some great techniques for doing that, which I'm happy to share with anybody that wants it. Good question.
Thanks, Max. There's another question that came in from Katie, which says, where can external benchmarks or best practices in terms of HR ratios versus employees be found?
Katie, speaking to that point, there are many people who provide it. There are all the standard kind of consultancies, Hayes, Tower, Mercer, etc. But be careful when you're looking at benchmarks. Let's say, I don't know whether we've got Tesco and Sainsbury on the call today, but let's use as an example. Let's say that Tesco, has got one HR employee per 100 other employees, and Sainsbury's got one per 50. Which one of those is correct? Benchmarking doesn't tell you whether the other people are doing the right thing. If everyone else is being a lemming and jumping off a cliff, you're just going to copy them. A far more effective way is to think about it in terms of this diagram and look at what works in your organization. For example, think about it this way. Let's say that you are a very high value added retail store. If you intend to be sort of a Waitrose in the sense that your employees are given tons of training about product, etc., you're going to need to spend a lot more money on training than a store like Netto or Lidl, for example, where you want to stack them high and move the stuff out as fast as possible. So if you benchmark yourself against another type of company whose culture or the way they do things is different, benchmarks can be very misleading. Whereas looking in our own organization, what is the impact of training on our objectives is far more effective than saying, what is everybody else doing?
Very interesting. Thank you, Max. So do we have any last questions before I will switch to just play out the rest of the video so that you can see how it turned out for Virgin? One thing I'd just like to touch upon here is when we send the slides out to you, on the last page here, we've got contact details for Top Employers Institute in the UK, and we've also got Max's contact details here as well. And as he mentioned earlier, he has a LinkedIn group that looks at this kind of thing, which is an invite-only group, but there'll be a link on it if anybody would like to request to join that group, and it might support you in your endeavours in this area. So if there's no other questions at this point, I'm going to play out the rest of the video. I will be online if anybody wants to ask me any questions that I might be able to ask about the video. I'll finish recording at the end of that, and then we will look at how we can make this recording available to anybody who wants a copy. So thanks for your time and your attention today, and for those of you who put questions in as well.
We developed a conflict avoidance workshop for...
I'm going to just reload that again because it's got an echo on it. And I'm going to go to 380.
Or understanding what the business needed, and our behaviours and our values, and how that linked back right to the customer experience, their satisfaction, and ultimately profit. So using that model and the understanding of how Kirkpatrick worked, we were able to devise a toolkit which we call the methodology, and it's just a series of really probing questions that get underneath the skin of what the business really needs, or each of the functions. We did run into some challenges. So lack of clarity from the business was one of the challenges. So, you know, thinking that they thought clarity from the business was one of the challenges. So, you know, thinking that they thought they needed one thing, whereas we'd go in and do lots and lots of questioning and shadowing to really understand what it was that they wanted. So just trying to convince them actually that they thought they needed A solution and we came up with B, why that would work, and also working with them on what they wanted the outcomes to be, and they weren't always very clear on that. The other challenges we had were working with the unions really, who were a little bit reluctant to engage with anything that they thought might be performance management or appraisal processes that are linked to pay. So we devised a new process for our frontline teams, which we call Time for You, and that is driven by discussion about their development and career aspiration, which we can then link back to some of the learning solutions that we put in. And we've been able to measure the success of that by internal promotions or people moving into new roles as a result of having those conversations. We work very closely with the unions now, and we have a team of union learning representatives who work with us to develop lots of different things we wouldn't have thought of. So, for example, mental health first aiders was an intervention that came from the unions that we've now implemented, which has then had a big impact on our absence management and understanding mental health at work. So it works perfectly. We developed a conflict avoidance workshop for all frontline teams because we could see physical and verbal assaults from customers to our frontline teams going up. So we devised an intervention. We worked very closely with the business, and then after 6 months we were able to measure how many verbal and physical assaults had been happening, and we saw a drastic reduction, and we could even take it right down to location, so King's Cross, Edinburgh, and we've seen a huge drop in those sorts of assaults because our people are able to manage that better. Well, we've looked at a couple of key themes to measure ROI. So we've focused on our people engagement, and we've looked at Net Promoter Score, so that's where our customers become advocates of the business. And we've seen year on year an increase in our people engagement scores, and last year we had the highest engagement score in the 4 years that we've been running the surveys. We had a score of 73%, which is excellent, and for our industry that's the highest scoring train operator. And from a net promoter score perspective, we've increased that enormously. So we were 27 points, which is exceptional for a small brand like East Coast, and we expect it to go higher now. We've got Virgin East Coast on there too. Really well, and I think the exec have been able to feel very confident in the ability of the team and what we've delivered. And that's come through in a number of ways. So our budget has increased over the last couple of years. We are brought in very early on projects now. So the team are included in anything that's going to change the business. And we've got a great reputation in the business as a team that does deliver. We have changed some of our programmes and workshops as a result of the ROI exercise. And when I look at something like discipline and grievance as a workshop that had been running for years, when we really looked at the feedback from the delegates and the feedback in the business KPIs, we could see it wasn't making an impact at all. So again, we worked with the unions and we worked with our managers to see what we could do to really change the programme. So we overhauled it. We now work in conjunction with the unions, they help deliver it, and with our HR team. And we've seen disciplines and grievances reduce over the last 18 months. So they're thrilled with that result. It's second nature for them now to always start with the outcome as opposed to the solution. So really trying to find out what the need is and design something that's bespoke for that team. And they have really developed as a team, and they're over the moon with the results. It's definitely worth putting the time and effort in to measure ROI. I think it gives the learners a much deeper experience. It makes my team really think about what they're designing and delivering as opposed to just running the same old workshop. And we have seen some great business results as a result of those changes. So any learning and development team that are struggling with, where do we start and what do we do? Just taking a step back and thinking, what are the small things we can start to measure and then build up to that? I think it's really worth putting the time in to do that. When somebody's asked you to come in and design a solution, then really start to understand what it is that they're after. Because sometimes I think they're not quite sure themselves. And just having some great questions in your toolkit is essential when you're trying to get to an outcome that you can measure.
Okay, so that's the end of the webinar today. I hope that you've enjoyed it and found it valuable. We've had some feedback appear already in the chat function box, and it appears that there already might be a bit of demand for a second webinar. So thanks all for your time, and we will send out the slides, contact details, and also within the next couple of days you'll receive a link to do a quick survey to let us know how we did and what you'd like in the future. So for now, we'll say goodbye.
And thank you. Yes, thanks, Wolf. Thank you very much from me, and a great pleasure. And thanks for the great questions and the opportunity to share with everybody.
And thank you so much for being our subject matter expert, Max.
A great pleasure. Thank you, Al.
Take care.